Power distance is the degree to which a community, a business, or a company expects and follows through with some degree of power inequality. Now, that's not necessarily a horrible thing. If you think about the legislative branch, the executive branch, and the judicial branch of government, like the Supreme Court, the President, the House of Representatives, and the Senate, they all operate off a concept known as high power distance. So, an easy way to think about this is imagine like a courtroom. If you go into a courtroom, there's going to be a lot of structure and a lot of adherence to the structure typical of a courtroom. Even the judge, they're typically referred to as your honor, and they have a hammer, or I think the formal word is a gavel, that they will smack on the table to wield authority. So that is a perfect example of high power distance. Essentially, that judge exhibiting a significant amount of power over everybody else in that courtroom. Now, there are cultures, companies, people who exhibit high power distance, and then there's those who exhibit low power distance. Now, to use this example, let's just kind of move it over to a career or a company or a business setting. If you have a supervisor who is usually very focused on titles and structure and due process, then more likely than not, that person operates from a high power distance. Conversely, if you have a supervisor or a leader that tends to exhibit a lot of relatability, and by the way, this doesn't have to do with less or more leadership, but rather how that leadership is exhibited. So, going back to that other example, a leader who is, for instance, much more relatable, who seeks common ground, and who keeps a curious mind, usually that person operates from a low power distance. In other words, they don't necessarily see an inequality between themselves and the team or the rest of the people. So I want to break this down a little bit because these are some of these invisible cultural forces that often play out in the workplace. And sometimes we don't even know about it. So, first and foremost, when we think about a high power distance, remember this isn't about ethics or right or wrong, even though sometimes that could take place with high power distance because the nature of high power distance is ultimately a sense of inequality between the people who are being led or who are following through within that system. But when we think about high power distance, imagine, for instance, TSA or the airline industry. So I talk about TSA in my book. Everybody recognizes the value of TSA, right? I mean, without TSA, the airways wouldn't be safe. And yet they operate from a concept of compliance and adherence. So if those are the two main goals, which they happen to be for TSA, then high power distance works. And it not only works, it's somewhat expected, right? Similar to the case with the courtroom setting. I mean, there needs to be a very formal structure in the legislative and the judicious system in order for laws to be implemented and to be followed and whatnot. Going back to the example with airport security, there needs to be a very strong sense of who these individuals are and what their position is relative to you and I as passengers. So for instance, if you're going through TSA and you decline a certain type of screening or you get all worked up over the way that they're asking you questions, more likely than not, that TSA agent will call over their supervisor. And in doing so, they've increased that power distance relative to you. So ultimately, their main goal is compliance. That means it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, they want to make sure that when you get on that airplane that you've complied with their rules, their expectations, and everything that has to do with airport security. It's adherence. So power distance works very well there. Now, let's use as an example a supervisor or a boss within a company, right? And this individual, let's just say, think about the typical person who leads with titles, like, oh, I'm the CEO or I'm the director or I'm the executive manager or the executive account manager of blah, blah, blah. People who tend to lead with their title, remember, it's not a bad thing, but typically when you find somebody that tends to lead with their title and pushes the title, they're exhibiting high power distance. They want their power distance, they want their power rather, to be respected, understood, and acknowledged. So trying to relate with those people is not going to work because they don't really care for relatability, at least not immediately. What do they care about? The use of titles. Typically, when there's comments around escalation, for instance, hey, we need this done tomorrow, or we're going to have to escalate it. What's going on there? Increasing that power distance. So they ultimately want compliance and adherence. They want you to do something in turn so that they can achieve whatever outcome they're looking for. So keep in mind, I want to re-emphasize this. It's not good or bad. It's effective or ineffective. If you run a team, for instance, sports teams are a great example. Like with sports teams and coaches and things like that, although there is obviously structure and discipline in any number of things, they tend to operate with very low power distance because high power distance is not very effective in motivating, right? Or relating. So let's just move over to this other segment over here on the other side of the board. If your goal is to decrease the power distance, in other words, to become more relatable, then you need to be, well, first cognizant of these things that will trigger high power distance. Because if you continue to trigger this, even if you're unaware of that, you're going to be harming yourself. And in fact, there's a really easy example, and this really has nothing to do with if the supervisor or the director or your leader is likable or not. For instance, you might have a very likable type leader. And let's just use this example. Hypothetically, you run into their boss somewhere within the company, and you guys start talking about the weekend or some other thing, and then invariably the topic of work comes in. So you just have a normal discussion with your supervisor's supervisor, okay? And later on, your supervisor learns of the fact that you had this interaction. So this interaction, should be very, very regular, very standard, very normal. If your supervisor reacts with something to the effect of, hey, you got to let me know if you're ever talking to so and so, like don't kind of leave me blindsided to this. I want to know what's going on. And if they get worked up over the fact that you went one level above them or higher for that matter, they exhibit high power distance. Even if they're friendly, even if they're likable, even if they're approachable, even if they're any number of things, somebody who tends to be very focused on that due structure, due process, and wants to know and reinforce that hierarchy or that organizational chart, they typically operate with a high power distance. So just be aware of that, because trying to relate to them from that perspective is only going to harm your chances of success in your own corporate career. So the best thing you can do in those instances is, as long as you're fine with it, follow suit. Just be the direct contact with them. Or if you do go about your way, and just because of your style and your personality, you do like to interact with other people and other leaders, which, by the way, I totally would suggest you do, then just keep them informed. For instance, if you run into your supervisor's boss, then when you talk to your supervisor, let them know, hey, I ran into, Jerry, or I ran into Karen or whatever, and we talked about this, and that. So you kind of fill in those blind spots for them so that they don't feel like they've been skipped or in any way, shape, or form misled, right? Okay, let's move over to decreasing power distance. If you want to motivate your team, if you want to be more relatable, then you really do need to go over on this side of the board, because this is where you're going to find all these keys. So I would say the first thing you probably want to do is stay curious. If you want to reduce the power distance, keep a curious mind, especially if you are a leader, right? So rather than, for instance, when you present yourself in a meeting, rather than say, I'm so and so, I'm the director of blah, 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 and I have 40 years with the company, and, I'm blah, blah, blah. So you're leading with titles, you're leading with, all these, experiences or skills. That tends to increase that power distance. So something you might say, and this, by the way, you can remain entirely neutral and natural, is to say, hey, I'm so and so, I'm really excited to be part of this meeting today. This is one part of our business that I don't really know much about, or I want to learn more about this, it's really top of mind for me. So I'm just really excited to be part, and thank you for including me in this discussion. So you've immediately lowered the power distance. Why? Because you're finding common ground and you're staying curious with the rest of the group. That doesn't mean you need to dismiss your experiences, your title, or your position. You can absolutely say that. What I'm suggesting is don't lead with it. Because when you lead with those things, you invariably increase that power distance. Now, what else could you do? I'll give you an example. The other day, I ran into an executive director within my company, and the first thing I did is I took a glance at his shoes, and he had some really cool looking shoes. So I looked up at him and I said, "Those are some really nice shoes." And he looked back at me, and you know, I don't know that he necessarily expected it, but he said, "Thank you. I really appreciate it. I love my shoes. I've, I got this pair recently, but I've always worn a similar pair." They had like these little tassels on them, and I was telling him during a recent visit or trip I had to Singapore. There's a street in Singapore called Orchard, and it's all these famous like European, like Italian and French, fashion designers. So I just noticed, and I don't know much about this, but I did notice some of those shoes there. So I said, "Oh, I made that comment." I said, "When I was in Singapore recently, I noticed that a lot of the trend around there includes those shoes, or has those shoes with those little tassels. Apparently they're coming back or something." Well, he loved that comment. He loved that I said that. And it just made him feel seen, for who he is, more so than the position that he wields. In doing so, we found common ground. That immediately lowers that power distance. And when you lower the power distance, you become relatable. Lastly, there's shared meaning. So shared meaning is really easy. It's just we don't do it enough. For instance, let's say again you're a leader within your organization, and I'm just going to use a sports team. Let's just say that you root for the Ohio State Buckeyes, and it's like the big game against Michigan, and you're looking for, I don't know, just other people who root for the Buckeyes. And then the moment you notice them, the best thing you could actually do is just go talk to them, be a normal person, and just speak to those individuals who they've already shown their allegiance, if you will, in a way. So there's shared meaning right there, and you can become instantly relatable just by having that conversation. In fact, I have seen this happen over here in TSA, like with TSA security at the airport security. Like one TSA agent, as they were going through somebody's luggage, they said, "Oh my gosh, this is," I forget even what the item was, but I think it was a camera of some kind. And she said, "I love this camera. I have one like this." So even within a high power distance culture, you can exhibit relatability. And that makes you a much more impactful leader than if you just kind of stick to this side over here. Well, if you stay here, people might admire you. They might say, "Oh, this person is incredibly talented or driven or motivated or, whatever," but they won't relate to you. And in failing to relate, you're going to kind of remain isolated. So, anyway, these are two ways to really focus on either increasing power distance or decreasing power distance, depending on what your goal is. So, remember, it's not, one is better than the other. Technically, I would say lowering power distance tends to always produce better results, but there are a few exceptions. Like when safety is involved, let's just say that there's building's on fire, high power distance helps there. It's like, "You three, you need to get out, move out this door." So it's very directive, very authoritative. And in that case, it's needed because there's lives are on the line. So there necessarily needs to be a very directive form to approach that situation. But that shouldn't be the way that we approach most situations. It really should go this way. And also keep in mind that certain cultures, like actual countries, will foster more or less of this power distance. So, Latin American cultures tend to have higher power distance than cultures in, Western, in like the West, like the US, Australia, Canada, Europe, etc. And you'll find this pretty much across everywhere, even within segments. So, um, if you want to learn more about this, follow me. I'm going to continue to post more videos about these invisible forces that are working culturally and that they can significantly impact your ability to lead and even your own beliefs. So, anyway, hope this was helpful, and we'll catch you guys next time.